Hello and welcome back to Scale War Machines. This in my hand is a 100mm bust of Major John Howard from Normandy. This is a low production run resin offering from RP Models, and I've reviewed it in the past. In this film I'm going to explain how I painted it, and it was a bit of a quick paint job. So stay tuned to see how I painted this 3/4 bust in a bit of a hurry. Here we go. So if you're interested in this 100mm 3/4 bust, then check out a review I made of several RP Models references. They were supplied by Hysterex agents, and that's where I got these figures. As you can see, they make a whole range of captivating subjects, and this was the one I chose to build and paint. They were all produced in limited numbers, and each came with a signed certificate of authenticity. If you want to find out more, you can of course check out the other video. Like many figures nowadays, these are computer designed, then a master is produced and it's recreated in resin via casting. Anyway, let's crack on with construction. As you can see, whenever you tackle something like this, it's going to be very different from your plastic injection moulded references, and of course everything is poured into silicone moulds. That's why you get all these mould release tabs and various bits of flashing and so on. So job number one is to clean it all up. Here using my faithful Minicraft drill with a sanding drum bit. Grind away any excess, and then of course you can finish up with things like sanding sticks or sandpaper. The moulding detail on this particular reference wasn't too bad. There were a few little marks and evidences of the 3D printing on the master, but generally I could get started and grind away any of those moulding plugs. Razor saws are really useful for cutting away most of the excess material. A scalpel too will help you just to remove any imperfections or surface spill from the mouldings. It's a good idea to test fit everything and make sure that it will go together without too many unsightly gaps or problems. Notice in the background all the small components, many of which have flash around the moulding lines. Another option is to use sanding discs, as you can see here, applied to a rubber-backed pad in a mini drill. Great way just to get rid of all those imperfections on the ammo pouches. I pre-drilled various components, and that would become useful later when I mount them on pieces of wood for painting little sticks. Pre-drilling helps with that, and also for the arms and hands. A bit of pre-drilling helps you to pin them if need be, and you can make sure that they fit properly, and you can move them around the pins and adjust them as necessary. The finer items, like here the sten, are carefully cleaned up with a scalpel to get rid of the mould seam marks and imperfections there. Just be careful not to damage any of the delicate, intricate details. But it's a fairly tough resin, and it was quite easy to work. Here's the sten Mark V, cleaned up and ready. I drilled out the barrel with a pin vise, simply as it was a solid moulding and wasn't realistic. I like to fill in any damage or areas where I'm not too keen on the detail, or in this case I'm actually trying to impart a bit of texture onto an otherwise flat and featureless moulding. For that I use Tamiya grey putty, thinned with acetone, and as you can see, by stippling it all over the exterior of the pouch, it just adds a bit of fabric texture, a bit more relief to an otherwise slightly bland part. And there you can see the texture effect on the side of the ammo pouch. I'll finish off the top in the same way. I decided to do the same for the Hessian camouflage strips in the helmet. Here I'm doing a bit more cleaning up with thinned down Tamiya putty that's been diluted, and that's just to tidy up some of the sanding marks and other little areas that I've put into the model by sanding and cleaning it up. Notice the face is a nice moulding, and the head itself has lots of character and aggression, even if he is holding his sten by the magazine, which of course we know is bad practice. We'll overlook that though, because it is after all an artistic representation. Now notice here I'm using cuticle pushers. I nip the pointed bit off, and then because I've pre-drilled a lot of these components, I can insert the cuticle pusher, and that gives me a way of holding the piece ready for painting. Neat little tip there. You can of course super glue them in, but I find this is a great way to hold pieces and simplify the painting process. I'm just test fitting the arms, making sure everything fits as well as it can. Now obviously in these low run resin artisanal models, it's not going to be perfect fit. It's definitely worth checking everything and making sure that everything's going to line up and work. Obviously you're going to be doing some filling at some point. The glues I tend to use for construction of resin parts are Deluxe Materials cyanoacrylates or superglues. And recently I ran out of Rocket Blaster, which is their catalyst, and I realised how integral that product is to the whole process of assembling figures using superglue or cyanoacrylate. Yes, make sure you get the Rocket Blaster in this case, which is their catalyst. It just transforms everything, so you can apply your glue, give it a spritz of catalyst, and then it sets instantly. But with the catalyst it will hold it and glue it tight. With both arms on, it's a case of making sure that the gun will sit properly in the hands as part of your assembly. Need a bit of filling underneath, and just tried to hollow out the sleeves just to make it look a bit more realistic. Here I am testing everything and seeing whether it can be made to fit. By this stage I wasn't quite happy with it, so I did detach the arm and just fine-tune everything to try and get it to fit better. Got everything lined up, and then used the very liquid Rocket Hot Red from Deluxe Materials. It's their super runny glue, and that will flow into every crevice and crack. So once it had been lined up, pretty much to my satisfaction, that could be used. And you see me reach for the ever-important Rocket Blaster to set it in place. So with the arms glued, I had to do a little bit of finagling to get that to work. Here you can see it's starting to look better. Time to fill in any gaps. Again, liquefied putty. And part of this is also in aid of speed, wanting to make this a quick build. It dries pretty much as quickly as the acetone will evaporate, so it's a great way of rapidly filling your figurines or models. You can use something like these wax carving tools and apply the putty neat in order to fill bigger gaps. And then thin it down afterwards with your acetone. That's another option where you've got bigger gaps like under the sleeves of this particular reference. With that done and items either on cuticle pusher sticks or attached to some sort of backing sheet, my thoughts could turn to painting, and with models like this in resin, or indeed if you do multimedia kits as well, always a good idea to primer it. There's a quick test fit. I'm looking forward to painting this. So I can move over to the spray booth and start to think about priming. I'll be using Vallejo Surface Primer in grey, which is a great all-purpose primer, which gives a good finish and covers any blemishes and problems prior to painting. The airbrush I'm using is the Iwata HPCH, and I'm just spraying repeated fine coats of the Vallejo primer over, in this case, the accessories, but as you'll see, everything gets its coat or coats of primer. And you can see they come up pretty well. Detail looks good. You can clean up any bits of dust and debris using a fine scalpel. And of course you can do any final coats or touching up with your primer, in this case at the desk. One of the noticeable things about things like the canteen is everything seems quite flat, but we're going to use painting to bring everything a bit more to life. The idea here is speed, so the techniques you'll see me use are different from what I'd use these days. There are still some visible marks, particularly on the stem, from the 3D printing process that yielded the master. I just decided to live with it. We're going to start off then by painting the eyes and the teeth. And as you can see, some of the primer has worn off, or I've done a bit of sanding and cleanup. It doesn't really matter because it can always be covered up with your subsequent coats. But as speed is of the essence, I just went on ahead and took an off-white colour and picked out the eyeballs. And you'll see later on I'll use the same shade for the teeth as well. Just lathering it on. I'm not particularly worried because there's going to be lots of painting subsequently. Just get them marked out. Approximate is fine. I then turn my attention to the teeth. This model has a fantastic aggressive look from the attacking stance of Major John Howard on the night of Normandy invasion. Of course, he was involved in the Pegasus Bridge raid and the capture of that vital transport link. So one of the fun parts of model making, of course, is to represent real figures from history. When it came to painting, I used a little bit of Vallejo, here's some burnt umber, and later on quite a bit of life colour. One of the problems with this model, as you can see, is there's that flat area in the void under the helmet. There's no attempt to make that appear hollow, so I made sure I painted it in a dark colour, and using that same dark browny colour I picked out the eyeballs and then just try and get them fuller and fuller and also equally balanced across the face. So start with one eyeball, get the gaze working, and then if we spool on you can see me do the other side. Obviously it's crucial when you start the second one to make sure that they're correctly aligned and everything is looking evenly balanced. I'm constantly checking, taking a step back and having a look, making sure it's all appropriately aligned, and that's basically the eyes mapped out. The reason why it's so messy is because of course I can go in with white and tidy everything up, but that's a suitable starting point for us. What I tend to do is start by just removing all the overspill around the eyelids and around the eye, and then I'll go into the eyeball itself and tidy it up. There we go, here's the finished effect. As you can see, here's the flesh paint set from Lifecolor, and that's what I used for the face on this particular reference. You'll notice I've applied a little bit of a dark wash to the teeth as well, and that was done off camera just to give a bit more definition and help with the painting process. To paint the face I generally use the set exactly as it's intended, so there's a dark base colour, and I'll put all the references up on screen as per usual. The key to this and any acrylics, remember, is thin translucent coats, and just work gently building up colours and layers, and you'll see me doing that. So I start off by adding shadows to the straps for the airborne troop helmet, and all these shadows will become important in subsequent layers. You can see I'm not using a wet palette in this case, just keeping the brush moist, and I really was quite haphazard with this, just slapping it on and then blending it with a moistened brush. You can of course do this really easily with acrylics as long as they're not dry, so they're still blendable. With that done, I move upwards, further up the face, and continue to add these loose, haphazard shadows. Basically I'm painting in any area where there's shadow, so under the nose, under the eyebrows, around the eyes as well. I like to pick out the eyes with the flesh base colour that I'm using. I'm not really obsessing about being super neat, just blocking it in. The next step is to pick out the borders of the eyes, again using this simple dark base shade. I'm trying to neaten everything up as I go. Notice I'm using quite a lot of unblended lines, and this was something I did on this face and it actually worked out quite well. You'll see in the stills at the end, the first paint reference went on in these lines, essentially, shadows and lines, and then I built the flesh colours on top of that. Obviously the areas around the eye above and below are important, and that will be picked out in deep shadow. I'm just using a bit of plastic or acrylic as my mixing palette. And here's how he looks, not super neat, not super fussy. Plenty of random lines, but generally there's shadows in the important areas. Time for the next paint reference, which I'll put on screen, and this was combined with the first of the real flesh colours, in this case First Light. What I did here was mix them up on a aluminium blending palette to get something in between. But using these references, I'm going to try and pick out the lower eyelid. So obviously it's a lightened version, more of a highlight. And this for me was just to try and bring the eyes back to life and start shaping them a bit better. I will be going back to shadows quite soon, but it just helped me to frame the eyes a little bit. Here you can see that I've just hit the eye bags there. Talking of shadows, I've gone back to a darker red-brown mix, and this is because I want to add a bloodshot effect. This will be, if you like, the blood vessels at the edge of the lower eyelid and upper eyelid. I use this same very dark shadow just under the mouth and in one or two other areas as well. Next I went for a leather warm shadow reference. Again, these are all Lifecolors. This is going to be used right around the most dark areas like the nostrils, and you'll also see at the border of the strap and webbing gear for the helmet and the face. I'm using it here to underline the moustache, but you'll see me go around the whole of the face adding thin but very dark shadows in certain key areas. To get the moustache effect, I'm just doing vertical lines very fine, and I'll build up on that throughout the whole painting of the face. And here you can get, with a fine brush, that super dark shadow right in at the edge of the helmet strapping. You can see how these successively applied thin coats are starting to build up real depth in the face. Okay, time now for the flesh, and this is flesh first base. I'm going to mix the first base with this warmer shade to get my midtones. What I'll do is I'll reach occasionally for a bit of water, and without using a wet palette, just on a metal palette like that, you can start to blend those shades in. Obviously if you're doing this in a very warm climate, the paint's going to dry super quickly, but in this case you can see they're going on nice and thin and they're not drying out at all at this stage. I haven't used any retarder or anything. Again, you can apply lines upon lines, so in other words highlight lines above the dark shadow lines, but you can also just scratch it in like that as well, just to infill. The neck is obviously the easy part, and attention will soon have to turn to the actual delicate, intricate part of the face. But as you can see, I'm proceeding quickly and just painting those vertical streets in, doing a bit of blending as I go. For the face then, it's a similar technique using this mid-tone mix. I'm going to start painting in and around all those darker streaks and shadows, trying to infill but also let them just shine through just very subtly as shadow areas. Anyone who's followed the channel will notice I don't have one particular technique for painting figures' faces or figures. I just experiment and try different things. I don't really advocate for any particular paint range or way of doing things. I'm still very much an amateur in figure painting, but I do really enjoy it, and I really enjoy showing people the results of my experiments and trying different paint ranges and trying to get different effects on figurines. But you can see the figure's face now is starting to blend nicely between the shadow and the midtones. Here I'm starting to patch in the colours around the nose. Again, these aren't highlights, they're just somewhere in between the darkest shadow and the mid-tone. As I progress, I'm starting to lighten it by using more and more of the flesh first base. I wouldn't say these are really highlights as such, they're kind of mid-lights, you know, taking that mid-tone and just making it a little bit lighter, lighter and lighter. And that is starting to get the face to pop. And the blending is occurring really on the face. It's just a case of picking out protruding elements, feature details on the face, things like eyebrows, furrow lines in the brow, of course the nose obviously, the top of the cheekbones. Also of course the eyelids can be worked ever more finely and carefully until you get to something approaching a mid-light, highlight, something that's definitely lighter. I added a little bit of this orange shade to the mid-tone mix just to warm things up a bit, and you can see me applying it here. And going back to the neck area next to the shadow around the strap. Again, this will live between the dark shadow and what will become the highlights all over the face. This all adds to the illusion of depth. Here you can see where we're left with the mid-tones and just reinforcing the occasional shadow here and there. Just helping to blend between all the shades and adding a bit of variety as well. The key is not to have just a uniform colour. Again, it's a blend of all the same paints, really, the same 3 paint references. Just building it up in layers. The hands of course need a similar treatment, and the process is exactly the same. As you can see, I start with the dark shadow mixes, picking out all the recesses, and then I'll progress to the mid-tones and eventually the highlights. At this stage I mask off the face so I can paint the helmet. I just mask it off and then I can spray the helmet just to make it nice and quick and simple, and it's sprayed with an airbrush and a Lifecolor olive drab reference. You can see detail on the helmet is not amazing, it does look slightly toy-like I would say. and certainly not that three-dimensional, but our mission is to get painting to try and make it look a bit more realistic and a bit more convincing. I'll be using various techniques to try and accentuate that detail and get it to appear a bit more realistic. At this stage I also blasted all the accessories, as you can see, again with Lifecolor paints. They're attached onto their backing, so it's quite easy to do. And the torso itself was given a very quick and dirty spray in the chosen colour for the Denizen Smock. Again, these all come from the excellent Lifecolor uniform references and box sets. For speed, I made sure to add shadows using the airbrush, so I didn't have to brush paint them. And it was easy just to spray in the darker shadow area onto the uniform tunic or smock and achieve quick and easy shadows. I then raided another Lifecolor box set, their hemp ropes and tarps, and used some of these references, either brush painted or airbrush painted, to block out some items of the webbing like the haversack and the pistol holster, etc. Any straps and webbing on the actual figurine itself was painted in this same box set and the same colours. It's actually one of my favourite colour sets from the Lifecolor range. It's got lots of good canvassy type tones within it. I was able to whiz my way around the model, just picking out the webbing belt and straps and ammo pouches, just using a good quality brush. I made sure to raid a bunch of Lifecolor acrylic box sets to pick out all sorts of different colours of Hessian on the helmet. This is the beginning stages of trying to make this look better and more realistic. Mixture of different greens and canvas shades. Once I've painted the leather strap, again references from the Lifecolor leather set, it's time to remove the masking tape and unveil our subject once again. And it's starting to look pretty good. My idea for the colour scheme of this was to try and depict a sort of nighttime look, because this was after all a nighttime raid just on the eve of the actual invasion. So I did go with the darker colours and darker general look. As you can see, I've started to paint the weapon itself, some wood colour on the stock, again just thinly applied, very similar to how I did the shadows on the face. I've tried to get in some wood grain texture by using thin brush strokes with a lightened mix. The hands are pretty much as I left them, and the face too. Haven't done anything really since we last saw it. And you can see I'm using a lump of plasticine as a way to hold the 3/4 bust. Time to use the same leather shade to pick out the straps, or rather the chin strap on the face. A good set of references is of course key when you want to paint your uniform details, and here I use this excellent book by Histoire and Collection, and that gave me plenty of visual references for doing the camouflage and other aspects of the uniform. I use these sets from Lifecolor, two suitably militaristic sets intended for British and American uniforms. So I used that book and chose appropriate shades for the Denizen Smock. I started off with the reddish brown colour. Here you can see the reference I used. I really like this item of uniform. I think it's a great garment. And it's good fun to paint as well. It's not overly challenging as a camouflage scheme. And then it's really just a case of blotting out all the different irregular shapes that are so unique on this type of camouflage garment. It was based loosely off what I was seeing in the references, but also my own imagination, and I tried to get it to vary around seams, as if the garment had been sewn together from different pieces of the same sort of material, but it wasn't all perfectly joining. When I was happy with that, I could move to the green shade, and again the unique brush strokes so specific to this garment were really quite easy to paint. Notice how the airbrushed base coat is still showing through. Now I couldn't really get the same transparent see-through shadow effect where I was painting the camouflage, but I did try and maintain that effect that was underlying, and you can also add little highlights, as you'll see later. But I didn't put so much camouflage that the 3D effect or shadow and highlight effect of the airbrushed green underneath was overpowered or disappeared. I really wanted to keep that, as I was really liking how that was coming through. Here then you can see me adding some shadows in the form of darker versions of the base coat. Because this is a particularly brushed on camouflage effect, there's different intensities of colours when you look at the garments. So I do some slightly darker and later highlight versions and then blend those, just to try and replicate what I was seeing in my references. Here you can see that I'm adding slightly finer brush strokes, very much a feature of the uniform. And again, this is just with the base colour, or sometimes a darkened or highlight version. It's really a case then of continuing to work each colour, both red and green. This involves a bit of judging by eye and choosing appropriate shapes. But you can paint them in, and then as you proceed, what I did is just lightened versions of those original camouflage colours. They were intermixed and applied as brush strokes as well. Also, to bring a bit of life to the accessories, I blended in lighter highlights and variety in those base colours, blending with a soft brush. That just made the canteen look a bit more realistic. Here I am going back in with lighter versions of the green in this case, again doing long vertical strokes. I'm also blending in some highlights as I go. Take your uniform colours and add a lighter shade, something like dust I find works really well. What you do with that highlight shade is to pick out all the feature details, edges and lines around detail on the uniform. Each time you lighten your base coat and apply it around all the feature marks, edges and so on. This takes quite a bit of time, but it's really enjoyable, and it starts to create that three-dimensional impression that brings the bust to life. Time now to get the webbing and accessories looking that bit more 3D. This is of course common currency for a figure painter. I'm going for a highlight version of the base colour, which is then blended. That's used to pick out the top areas of detail, areas where the light would land. So those are all picked out, whether it's on the webbing, the holsters, any of the gear, and then blended. I also use this opportunity to attach the haversack rucksack. Having been given their highlight coats and blended. One of the first things to do to try and make the helmet more realistic is to dry brush the netting. As you can see, I got a very pale canvas shade, and just using the dry brushing technique tried to raise a bit of the detail and get it to look more authentic. I'll be doing more work on the netting and the helmet later, but for now it was time to do a quick test fit. And there he is, it's coming together well. With all the webbing accessories done, it was time to paint the straps on the helmet. Initially I thought these were leather, but actually they are a canvas item, according to my research. So I used the same shades from the hemp set from Lifecolor to pick out the straps. And of course don't forget there's all the shadow around the outlying edges of it. So it should give a pleasing highlight effect, especially when I go back again with the highlights. Now it's time to attach the other accessories, the canteen, holster and so on. Again, just with super glue or cyanoacrylate hit with a bit of rocket blaster. There are various little bits to attach as well, like the tail ends of the webbing. Let's focus on the hands and get them covered properly with their highlights and midtones. As you can see, the rest of the torso really is done. Into the final straight now. The Sten gun has received a coat of metal coat which has given it that metallic shine, done off camera. Again, using long streaks or brush strokes, I'm just trying to get the texture of the hand, and by doing long brush strokes and scratching it in, hopefully I can replicate the sort of texture of skin and the veins on the hand. I left it till last when I knew the bulk of the figure was done, but it's time for the flesh highlights on the face. So I go to the same flesh base mix I used, I think it's called First Base, but added now the highlight shade to it. And then the technique, as you'll see, is much like before. Same style of brush strokes, the same way of patching it in, blending it, sometimes using long streaks. Very much conscious of the nighttime look I want to try and get, the slightly darker, less artistic look. Trying to make it look a bit more grungy. The key really to doing these highlights successfully is to apply them with a fine round tip brush and then blend with a flat brush, as you'll see me doing that. So I'm hitting the cheekbone there, I then reach for my soft blending brush and then I'll gently feather the edges and just get the highlight to blend nicely with everything I'd done before. Every now and then, if I feel like I need to accentuate the shadows, I can reach for my shadow shades, blend them into the flesh, and just retouch things, in this case around the mouth and lips, and the strap for the airborne style helmet. I then reach for the highlight shade in the flesh set from Lifecolor. As you can see, it's a very bright pinky colour. That will be added to the mix to yield the final highlight shade. So a little bit of base and a little bit of the highlight mix. And then essentially the process is exactly the same, picking out the highlight areas, this time in finer detail and with a lighter colour. You can of course go lighter and lighter if you so wish, and that will give you the slightly more luminescent look that some painters like. In this case I didn't want that, I just wanted subtle highlights. So I made sure just to pick it out, not go super light. Just wanted a slightly darker look for this face. With a quick bit of blending, it starts to look much better. Lifecolors' excellent leather set provides an easy way to pick out any of the feature details around the uniform made of leather. In this case, the camouflage support band around the helmet, but also the chin protection at the base of the webbing straps. There's also a really useful brown shade just for things like facial hair. In this case, I picked out the eyebrows and the moustache. And then thanks to the leather set, you also get highlight shades within it, so of course you can do the scratching and chipping around the leather to show wear and tear. I made sure to paint the hair with a dark brown colour, and just to constantly move the head around, take a look at it, maybe add more highlights as and when necessary and blend them carefully. It's really starting to come together now, and this wasn't taking a huge amount of time. That's the beauty of working with acrylics. Very much near the end now. With the face pretty much done, it was time to add some much needed highlights to the canvas strap of the airborne troops helmet. And using the Lightened mix, I'm really going for the edges, any seam or sewing detail, and again a little bit of blending helps to make it look realistic and not too artificial. The same shade is used for the Hessian strips of camouflage on the actual helmet. There again, I'm trying to depict frayed and worn edges to the Hessian. So painting highlights along the edges helps with that effect. Soon I'll revert back to the straps, but for now it seems sensible to do the frayed edges on any of the lighter green Hessian strips, or indeed any other parts of the uniform that require that colour, in this case the lanyard for the pistol. Here you can see the shades I used and blended. I'm just mixing up yet more light highlight shade for the straps. And then it's really a case of picking out any of the stitching detail and just working your way along the edges. Repeated light thin coats. That's the trick. Here you can see the face has started to come together quite nicely with the subtle blended highlights, a slightly shadowy appearance of the face, depicting nighttime, and the highlights for the strapping, just making it stand out in relief and look a bit more realistic. Again, I'm no expert in this, but I just want to show people what's possible. And the more you practice, the more fun you have with figure painting. It's just a great, enjoyable pursuit. What I'll do at the end is I'll add up how many minutes of filming, and generally everything's filmed, so I'll give you a rough idea, because sometimes people ask me how long does it take to paint one of these, and I'll be able to show you. It really didn't take that long in my book. It's a shame that netting isn't more realistic, but we'll try and address that a bit later with some washes. The helmet chin strap of course needs some scratches as it is a leather item. It's a case of using their orangey highlight mix, blending that with the base colour and just putting in some fine scratches using a really fine brush. And there you can see the chin strap, highlighted face, and how it's all coming together. And then the final touch was to reach for the Lifecolor liquid pigments, and I mixed up some custom mixes of these excellent blendable and removable pigments, and I used those around the face mainly for shadow or 5 o'clock shadow type effects, but they're a really neat product and I made a video on those. Now these products I also used to attempt to address the netting, which was still bugging me and didn't really seem realistic enough to my eyes. These liquid pigments are a great way of doing something like this, a bit like you might do with a wash, an enamel wash or a solvent wash. They're particularly useful in things like the ears, but as you can see I'm applying them also to areas like the deep shadow around the helmet rim, just to darken everything up and make it look a bit more shadowy in there. So I just lathered in plenty of liquid pigments, and then when it dries you can use the bundled remover to get rid of any that's on the highlights. So I did that to the netting to try and get the effect I was after. You can dry it with a hairdryer and then just remove any of the excess with the remover. That seemed to improve it a bit, and I was a bit happier with that. Time to paint the iconic British enamel mug. This was done using a variety of colours, and I gave it a satiny, enamel-y feel by using some Tamiya clear, in this case their orange reference. Various chips and damage was applied, and that was done. Here's the face and helmet, and in the meantime you can see that the body has been mounted on a plinth, and it'll be time to join it all together. But first I need to do a little bit of detail painting of the figure, particularly things like buttons, epaulets and so on. You'll see me work on these whilst holding the model via the plinth and working my way through all the metallic components on the model. To do this I principally use the excellent alcohol based paints from Vallejo from their liquid metal set. They're really good. They aren't water based, so you need to mix them and then use something like alcohol as your thinners, but they are great, and you'll see here they give a really nice effect, particularly with a wash afterwards for things like buttons and poppers and buckles and that sort of thing. I use their bright silver reference to add scratches, chips and wear around the Sten gun and on other parts or metallic components on his gear. Just use an extremely fine point brush and paint on the scratches and chips. A little bit of colour was added to the epaulets and insignia on the uniform, and we're pretty much good to go. Once all those metal components have been painted, it's then really easy to add subtle shadows around them by using the liquid pigments from Lifecolor. They're quite easy to apply with a very fine brush, and of course you can blend them afterwards anyway, but they're a great way to pick out all little uniform details, seams, shadows around your belts and buckles and buttons, and any pocket details and things like that. The remover that comes in the liquid pigment sets of course makes it really easy to apply your shadows and then blend them, remove any excess and generally get a better finish. Here you can see final accessory items have been added and highlighted and blended as per the rest. Little details like the hand grenade is on the model, And I just go around just adding any final highlights on top of the metal work and shadows we did previously, just to make sure they pop. I mixed up a crimsony shade to paint the beret, which was tucked into the tunic, or smock rather. And with that, our Major John Howard is complete. And I particularly enjoyed painting such a large subject. It's not a perfect reference by any means, there are flaws and areas that you can improve, but the point is it's a really stunning reference when it's finished. It points to a great period of history and a fantastic character in an iconic military operation, and I just really enjoyed it. It was a joy to paint, and that's often the key thing, and I could rattle through it quite quickly. I've totted up all the footage that I filmed, and generally I'm filming all the time, so it gives me an indication how many hours it takes, and I'll put that on screen. There you go. That's how long it took. Alright, thanks for watching. I hope you enjoyed this, looking at a somewhat rapidly painted subject. It's not perfect, of course, and I don't claim to be an expert, but I certainly enjoyed doing it. And it's a 3/4 figurine or 3/4 bust that takes pride of place in my collection. Thanks ever so much for watching. If you enjoyed this and want to learn more about figure painting using different ranges of acrylic paints, then please subscribe and consider following. I don't just do figures, I do all sorts of other stuff. So please stop by, maybe consider giving a like or leave a comment. And if you want to subscribe, that would be good too. Okay, thanks for watching and bye.
Subscribe for our latest videos.